Welcome to the webinar this afternoon from Faith and Life Sciences and the Canadian Council of Churches. Really great to have you with us today. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this second in a series on CRISPR, from antiviral to going viral. The first one was about CRISPR and how it works technically. And we had a good conversation about that and all of the many ways that it can be used. And today it's the focus is more on human genome editing. Looking forward to the session today. Let me say that with all Canadian Council of Churches events, we invite you to just let us know who you are and to just jot down in the chat box if you'd like who you are and where you're from, maybe your church community, maybe the traditional territory that you're coming from. So my name is Peter Noteboom, and I serve as the General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches, and I'm in Toronto in the West End on the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit. And just a word about the Council. The Canadian Council of Churches responds to Christ's call for unity and peace. We seek Christ's truth with an affection for diversity, and we act in love through prayer, through dialogue, and through witness to the gospel. And in the membership of the Council, there are 26 member churches, and in the membership of the Council, that includes about 85% of Christians in Canada who profess adherence to a church. Good. So really great to have you with us again. As some of you are joining, let me invite you to just note where you're coming from, maybe your church community or your faith community, or the traditional territory that you're coming in from. Thank you to all of you for noting that in the chat box. That's great. Gives us a sense of who we're with here today. Let me also just say that I have felt especially blessed over the past 20 years or so now to be part of the Faith and Life Sciences reference group. And the leadership that group has provided in the Canadian Council of Churches has just been incredible. So tenacious, such high quality work, such careful theological and ethical reflection on incredibly fast moving issues of the day. And so just really pleased with the leadership there and all the folks who help make that work happening, including Rebecca Ivanoff, who serves as secretary of the group, my colleague at the council. So without any further introductory remarks, just a few brief ones, I'd like to pass it right on over to the co-chair of Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group, Dr. Peter Kuhnert. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your gracious welcome and introduction. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and webinar guests, Dr. Rusthoven and Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group members. My name is Peter Kuhnert, and I am the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada representative to the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group. And I am in Kitchener-Waterloo on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Neutral, and Haudenosaunee peoples. So welcome to the second session of our two-part webinar series on the gene editing tool CRISPR-Cas9. We've named our two webinar series From Antiviral to Going Viral. Many of you, of course, will have been with us for Dr. Rusthoven's first webinar, in which we had a detailed look into the structure and function of the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing tool, and began to consider some of the myriad ways in which this tool will be impacting humanity, including possibilities of editing out very precisely single base paired genetic mutations, which can cause diseases like sickle cell disease and thalassemias, and may also provide new ways of fighting cancer. In this webinar, Dr. Rusthoven is going to lead us in a review of international gatherings that have attempted in the past decades to regulate gene editing technology, and help us to think about who gets to decide on how such a powerful new technology gets to be deployed. And most importantly, from the perspective of our group, how our churches might raise their ethical and theological voices in this debate that will affect all of us. Now, as many of you know, the application of CRISPR technology is a huge area, and to cover its many dimensions is beyond the scope of just 2 webinars. And so just to avoid any disappointment, areas that we won't really be talking about today in any great depth include the potential weaponization of CRISPR technology, the benefit or threat of CRISPR technology to human food crops, and the potential for CRISPR technology to increase the speed of synthetic biology. So we're not going to be talking about those areas specifically today. At the end of our webinar, we will have a survey that we ask attendees to fill out. And there will be one question, I believe it's question 8 or question 9, which will ask attendees how we might further engage in this conversation together about how CRISPR technology is affecting humanity. Please take a moment at the end of the webinar to fill out the survey and tell us how we can continue this conversation. 2 technical points before I introduce our guest speaker today. If you have any technical issues with this Zoom webinar, please chat directly with either Grace McCreary or Rebecca Ivanov. That's Grace McCreary or Rebecca Ivanov if you have any tech issues. And we would like to gather questions after Dr. Rusthoven's presentation. So please write your questions in the chat site so that we can address those after the presentation. We have until about 5:15 today. So let me tell you a little bit about our main speaker today, Dr. James Rusthoven. Goes by Jim. Jim was born and raised in Chicago. He graduated from medical school at the University of Illinois and then went on to complete a fellowship in infectious diseases at the University of Chicago, and then came to the Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto to complete his fellowship in medical oncology. Jim is board certified as a medical oncologist in both Canada and the United States, and he is also certified in the US in infectious diseases. Jim has practiced medical oncology, taught residents, and engaged in clinical research, both at the University of Toronto and at McMaster University. And he then finished his medical career as a medical officer and evaluator of new cancer biologics for Health Canada. Jim also has a master's degree in biomedical ethics from the University of Toronto and a PhD in theology from the University of Bristol. He has taught biomedical ethics at several institutions. He's an active member of the Christian Reformed Church and a longtime member of this Our Faith and Life Sciences reference group. We are delighted to have Jim lead us in the second webinar on CRISPR-Cas9, and particularly thinking about who will determine the course of human genome editing. Jim, thank you so much for leading us today.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for the introduction, and welcome everyone who's chosen to spend some time with us today. Let me just pull up my share screen here in a moment. Okay. Now, as Peter said, this is part 2, and the title of part 2 is How and by Whom Will the Course of Human Genome Editing Be Determined? In the original title, we had the title From Antiviral to Going Viral. I just want to read some statistics to tell you how this is really going viral. Currently, I read here from a recent article, the CRISPR community encompasses more than 40,000 authors, 20,000 institutions who have documented their research in 20,000 published and peer-reviewed studies. So if that doesn't deserve its own journal, I don't know what does. I'll just give my disclosures. I have no financial conflicts of interest, real or potential. I do speak through a reformational Christian worldview, and I believe that human flourishing is fulfilled through faith in Jesus Christ. And I believe that Christians should promote biotechnology that can care for the welfare of human beings and the world around us. We'll talk today about how should somatic genome editing proceed? Should germline and heritable genome editing be permitted? And if so, who should decide how it is used? So we need to first distinguish there's a somatic and a germline / heritable type of editing. We talked about this briefly in the first webinar, but just to refresh your memory, somatic genome editing really refers to cells that are not capable of carrying the DNA of the individual to subsequent generations, whereas germline and heritable genome editing does involve those cells. Germline, without the word heritable, refers to research using sperm and eggs, for example. Heritable refers to the actual use of edited embryos, which are meant to be implanted. We'll talk a little about how decisions are made regarding genome editing development and clinical use, and by what mechanism, that is legislation versus commissions and summits. I'll just briefly talk about those distinctions. Who are the relevant societal stakeholders, and have they been appropriately involved? Are corrections in gene editing development or usage needed? And how can societal voices be heard and affect the outcome of policy decisions? I'm just going to start with a little history. In December of 1999, there was a convention in Oviedo, Spain, and that became known as the Oviedo Convention. And in that convention, among other points of topic, were comments regarding human genome editing. 29 European countries were involved, and 21 of them ratified the convention. That means in those countries, it became unlawful to do germline gene editing, but it was up to the individual countries to make those decisions. 6 of them had some reservations in their laws, and I think very importantly, neither the United Kingdom nor Germany signed or ratified. The United States was not involved because it was a European venture. The convention was meant to aim to protect the dignity and identity of all human beings, and this is a 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was established after the Second World War. And again, the most important decision for the purposes of this webinar is that interventions modifying the human genome may only be used for preventative diagnostic or therapeutic purposes, i.e. somatic genome editing, and only if not aimed to modify the genome. For heritable purposes. Sheila Jasanoff is at the Kennedy School at Harvard, was one of the pioneers in the area of scientific and technology studies back in the late 70s and early 80s. And she wrote a very interesting article recently, which says that there were 2 pivotal moments in gene editing, and I agree with her on this. The first was the Assimilar Conference in California in 1975, and this was prompted by controversies arising from the then technology of genome editing involving recombinant DNA experimentation. And the organizers, who were mostly scientists, concluded that geneticists should push research on recombinant DNA to its limits, and restraint was only needed when the research involved technically defined risks, such as endangering public health. Now, this was criticized by some non-scientists of the day as science is stepping in to shape forms of governance that societies are allowed to consider. That is, were scientists making the rules and setting the stage for what society would be allowed to discuss. And this was done, these critics claim, under the guise of responsible self-governing by science. A broad public dialogue is constrained by expert accounts of what is proper and not proper to discuss in such dialogue. And this spurred a controversy which goes on to this day. The wider public, as suggested by the conference, should defer to scientists. And this was, again, a major issue. Public opposition to science-driven agendas in such discussions reflects different ideas about how to live well with emerging technologies. And it's not evidence that the public is ill-informed and doesn't understand science. This is what Sheila Jasanoff stated, and I completely agree with that. The scientists addressed public concern without public involvement, And there's an interesting quote from Senator Edward Kennedy in those days, who essentially said they were making public policy and they were making it in private. This allowed research to proceed, but at the cost of public trust. So that was the first pivotal moment. The second pivotal moment is occurring now. And I want to just read a brief quote from a recent article by Françoise Baylis and her colleagues. She's at Dalhousie University in Halifax. She says in her introduction to this recent article, development of the CRISPR genome editing technology in 2012 and 13 intensified the decades-long controversy on the likely social consequences and ethical permissibility or impermissibility of heritable human genome editing. It's been subsequently claimed since 1975 that the framing of the risks and the stakes and the scope of deliberation by the Assimilar Conference was too narrow to encompass the wider range of ethical, legal, and social issues that were tied to a scientific revolution and forms of collective deliberation. Now, the ongoing challenge of democracy and governance is to confront the unscripted future presented by a new technology and to guide that future in sync with democratically articulated principles. Thoughtful conversations are compromised if they are limited to narrow constructs of near terms or immediate risk, foreclosing opportunities to build new norms for such new advances. So essentially this says, don't just sit on your laurels if you set up what you feel are guidelines, but make those guidelines malleable to the anticipated and unanticipated new technologies that come along. Good deliberative processes need to be recursive as well as inclusive, that is, reflective as things change. The initial framing of the issues shapes the analysis of tabled alternatives, whether scientific, ethical, or political. Now, the inclusivity at the agenda-setting table ensures that important perspectives are not left out. Provisionality, that is, being flexible and setting up provisions and renewing them as new technologies come along, includes the choice to say no to particular visions of progress. An enlightened and emancipated relationship to technology is the decision not to use it if it violates fundamental norms or rights. So those are the two pivotal moments, and we're right in the thick of the second one with CRISPR. In 2015, just 3 years after the initial article that completely described CRISPR and its potential use, there was the first international summit on human gene editing in the US in late 2015. Now, this was 6 months after a worldwide moratorium on making heritable changes to the human genome was proposed by two Nobel laureates, Paul Berg and David Baltimore, at the Assimilar Conference. So this is really a foundation of these next few years coming right up to today. This conference was at the end of 2015. It was initiated by National Academies of Sciences and Medicine in the US, as well as the Royal Society in the UK and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. It was a big meeting. It was called just months after the first CRISPR gene editing was accomplished in non-viable abnormal human embryos derived from in vitro fertilization. We talked a bit about this last time, about the repairing of a mutated beta globulin gene, which is the cause of beta thalassemia. The 12-member organizing committee were mostly scientists, and they crafted a formal statement. And that statement essentially said it was irresponsible at the time to proceed with any clinical use of germline editing unless or until safety and efficacy issues were resolved and a broad societal consensus could be achieved. The participants were David Baltimore and Paul Berg from the 1975 conference, but also Jennifer Doudna, one of the Nobel Prize winners for CRISPR recently, and others. So that was 2015. Just under 2 years later, there was a report on genome editing involving science, ethics, and governance. I just want to mention that briefly. This was written by a committee that convened as a follow-up to the dialogue established at the 2015 summit. It was meant to be a year-long in-depth consensus study with the intent that studying the state of the art of human genome editing, its potential applications, and the ethical issues that need to be considered in deciding how to govern the use of this powerful technology. It was a large committee. More than half of the participants were biology and genetics physicians or researchers. And as you can see here, there was a whole smattering of other individuals, mostly leaders in their field. And at the bottom was Professor John Evans, who was a sociologist from California. But he had written a somewhat controversial book in 2001, showing how commissions and summits are now composed mostly of scientists who tend to set the agenda for what we decide about the impact of gene editing on society. It also had a peer-reviewed independent panel of experts, including George Annis, a well-respected legal expert in Boston, and Ben Hurlbut, who is at Arizona State University and a professor of biology and society. And this group was meant to provide a candid, critical comment to ensure that the report of this group met standards of objectivity, evidence, and responsiveness. But the reviewers were not asked to endorse conclusions and recommendations. They did not see the final draft of the report before it was released, and their comments and draft manuscripts were kept confidential to protect the integrity of the process. The report concluded that ethically defensible germline editing would include changes to prevent serious disease and disability. That was a no-brainer. It said going further to insert traits that enhance otherwise healthy conditions were considered by many as an intrusion of autonomy and a threat to social stability. So here it was felt, first of all, it was not well defined of what enhancement was as opposed to resolution of disease to healthy conditions. And it mentioned nothing about communal or collective importance of the impact of these kinds of disturbances, just mainly the autonomy of the individual involved. As technical hurdles facing genome editing of progenitors of eggs and sperm are overcome, they stated, editing to prevent transmission of genetically inherited diseases may become a realistic possibility. So unlike the summit of 2015, less than 2 years later, the group was already talking about not whether we would probably be dealing with heritable genome editing, but it was now becoming a realistic possibility. It would just need to be approached with caution, but the caution didn't mean it should be prohibited. So if the technical challenges were overcome and the potential benefits were reasonable in light of risks, clinical trials could be initiated involving heritable genome edited embryos. So what changed from 2015 to 2017? This is summarized very nicely in a recent article by Françoise Baylis and Dalhousie. In 2015, there was a two-part ethical framework to resolve the safety and efficacy issues involved in CRISPR and other gene editing formats, and to seek a broad societal consensus. Now, they actually listed all the potential stakeholders that might be involved in trying to generate such a consensus. And I took this to mean it was an implicit call for slower or slowing of science to try to take the time to deliberate these issues. The key issue being, should heritable germline gene editing be permitted at all? Less than 2 years later, it was now the public, which was not defined in the report of this group, but the public should determine clinical trials using human germline genome editing should be permitted. And then there are provisos, providing the research only for compelling reasons and under strict oversight by specific criteria. So now the issue is they're no longer asking whether heritable germline gene editing should happen, but rather it's quite likely it will happen. Now the issue is, should it be permissible to consider enhancement changes? So the report concluded, oops, sorry. So in 2018, there was a second international summit. This consisted of 13 members, including David Baltimore, who goes way back to the 1975 conference, Jennifer Doudna, one of the pioneers in CRISPR development, and 3 members from the Tri-Council academies in the US. It acknowledged that clinical trials in somatic gene editing therapies were underway. We talked a little bit about those in the first webinar, but they were judged efficient and precise enough with diminishing off-target events, but they're certainly not perfect. Germline genome editing is still too risky and the results uncertain. They advocated for promoting public dialogue, increasing equitable access to underserved populations, and importantly, to establish standards for preclinical evidence. This came on the throes of an article that severely criticized one of the earliest phase 1 trials in cancer patients, where the preclinical evidence was extremely thin in justifying starting the phase 1 trial in human beings. And they recommended establish strong partnership with patients and their advocacy groups. Now, why were these summits and reports inadequate, according to some very important critics? Well, since the 2015 statement, summit leaders seem to no longer be committed to informing science's agenda for the wider human community, it was claimed. In reacting to Dr. Hayes' reported editing of human embryos in China at the 2018 summit, science leaders were no longer asking whether it is or ever can be acceptable to genetically engineer children such that they can pass on genetic traits to their offspring. But now science leaders are seeking to set standards for producing genetically modified humans. Science, says Hurlbut, must not presume to set the destination for a technology, but should be most importantly involved, involved in what is necessary for the people. Science is, he goes on, and must be in the service of the societies of which it is a part. Science leaders continue to follow a path to disengagement with society and self-regulation. The similar conference was composed of scientists who addressed public concern without public involvement. He again quotes what I mentioned earlier, the Edward Kennedy quote about the public policy being done in private. And it was an urgent need of global governance of this new technology. In concert with Sheila Jasanoff, Hurlbut recommended a global observatory for gene editing, what he called a modest experiment to convene conversations regarding progress toward consensus. This was just published 2 years ago. Will require a wide agreement about what needs to be discussed and in what terms, what is at stake, who are the stakeholders, what needs to be asked, and through what form of deliberation. Scientific assessment of safety and efficacy is necessary, of course, but all importantly, what is patient autonomy and what is human dignity in this context? That has not been very well understood. In 2019, a global moratorium in inheritable genome editing was proposed. Now, this had been proposed already way back in 1975. And in fact, this led to legislation in the US to ban heritable genome editing in law in the United States. But here, this is argument for a global moratorium. A fixed period, suggested maybe 5 years might be appropriate. It would be to establish an international framework through which nations could commit to not approve any use of clinical germline editing unless certain conditions were met. And very importantly, under the framework, nations would retain the right to make their own decisions. So Here we're talking about now national rights to do as they feel fit concerning governance, concerning policies with regard to heritable genome editing. During this time, it carried out discussions would be carried out on the technical, scientific, medical, societal, ethical, and moral issues. It did not apply to germline editing for research purposes only, so only for heritable genome editing where the embryo would be implanted for purposes of reproduction. And it did not apply to somatic therapies for purposes of treating diseases. So what would be considerations during this global moratorium, be it 5 years or whatever? Well, on the medical side, you'd have to say, what are the therapeutic alternatives to heritable genome editing therapy? There are a number that are currently available that could be used. In vitro fertilization plus pre-implantation genetic testing, however, don't always result in implantation or the completion of pregnancy. So would it be better to improve efficacy and safety of in vitro fertilization plus PGT, or to put effort into improving gene editing? Major question. For severe diseases carried out by one or both parents, where all children would have the disease, these parents could go to embryo adoption or gene editing if acceptable improvements were made. But this is a current option for them right now. During the moratorium, they could also talk about various other considerations, this broad societal consensus that keeps being bantered about. What in the world would that really mean in the current climate globally? It would be to establish a mechanism for equitable engagement of a wide range of voices. Individuals with genetic differences or disabilities may be stigmatized or discriminated against with genetic enhancement, and this would need to be discussed very carefully as to what is genetic enhancement, where are the boundaries between that and therapeutic. Religious groups may find redesigning fundamental human biology and its risk to human dignity morally troubling. And concerns for long-term psychological problems in children with edited DNA would have to be discussed and concerned. A year ago, a statement was brought out on heritable genome editing by a group that felt a course correction is needed, and quickly. You can see some of the names were names that we've already mentioned: George Annis from Boston, Marcia Darvanovsky of the Center for Genetics and Society at Berkeley, and our own Françoise Baylis at Dalhousie. They said they wrote as a group of public interest advocates, social science and humanities scholars, ethicists, policy experts, and life scientists who share a commitment to social justice, human rights, and democratic governance of science and technology. Their aim was to reorient the conversation around heritable human genome editing, which they felt was being misinterpreted. There were misunderstandings, and that the discourse was becoming muddied. And they were encouraging a robust consideration of social, historical, and commercial contexts that would influence the development of this kind of editing and how it shapes in its social effects. So essentially, they were very unhappy with the way the mainly scientists were trying to incorporate societal needs and concerns. And they said subsequent endorsements of their statement and additional calls for a moratorium from scientists, bioethicists, and technology executives, which we just talked about a moment ago, provides a welcome reminder that enthusiasm for heritable human genome editing is far from universally shared. So they said there's a course correction along 3 dimensions that should be done. One is a need for clarification. Heritable human genome editing is not a medical intervention, but rather it's a way to satisfy parental desires for genetically related children or children with specific genetic traits. Prospective parents at risk for transmitting a genetic condition already have several options available, as already mentioned. Patients who want genetically related children can do so with PGD, D standing for diagnosis here, as opposed to testing, though ethical questions exist about selecting among embryos to live or die. So here we have a junction of already established concerns about leftover embryos with in vitro fertilization and the selection of embryos by various procedures versus the concerns or the risks of introducing genetic traits by genome editing. According to these authors, it's modifying and introducing genetic traits through genome editing would vastly intensify the concerns that some groups already have regarding the use of human embryos, particularly those left over from in vitro fertilization. The second dimension is centering societal consequences and concerns. And the third is fostering public empowerment. And this, they say, requires participants to set the scope and framework of assessment with all aspects remaining open to debate. The scientists and their contributions should certainly be recognized, but should not dominate the agenda or the discussions. Finally, last year, there was yet another conference. This was an international commission, and I think the word international was more truly correct here because only 4 of the 18 members were from the US. For the previous members of previous summits or commissions, only 1 was listed. So it was becoming truly international in its scope and in its membership. The task was defining a responsible pathway for the clinical use of heritable human genome editing, should any nation permit its use. So here again, the bottom line seems to fall on national sovereignty with respect to these decisions. I won't go through all of the 10 recommendations and their sub-recommendations, but I will highlight just a few. One was to have extensive societal dialogue before a country is permitted to have HHGE. However, the Commission admitted that the societal and ethical issues they felt were beyond its charge. So it wasn't even mentioned. These weren't even mentioned in their report. Limited uses should be made if heritable human genome editing should be considered, and that should be restricted to serious monogenetic diseases, of which sickle cell and beta thalassemia, as we discussed at the first webinar, are just 2. And these diseases should be those with severe morbidity or premature death. In any country in which the clinical use of heritable human genome editing is being considered, researchers should adhere to the principles of human rights, bioethics, and global governance, as one would expect. But I think very importantly, it said reports of deviations should be reviewable to an independent committee. And I call this the whistleblower proviso, which means that accountability would be in a central group that could adjudicate concerns of violations. So what's happening in other areas internationally? Well, this year, the UN Convention on Biologic Diversity will be discussing genome editing under the auspices of synthetic biology and possibly the Cartagena Protocol, which was established in 2003 and was used to help give guidance to make sure that any genetically modified living organisms are safely transported and don't escape. The convention will negotiate if and how gene editing tools, including CRISPR, should be used and what risk assessment requirements should be. Now, the Convention on Biologic Diversity covers a lot of territory in a lot of areas, including agriculture. They put out a report in September of last year, which concluded that 20 goals set 10 years earlier by 196 countries for preserving flora and fauna, that only 6 of those targets were even partially met. And they concluded that biodiversity continues to be lost. There's also a group called the International Association for the Conservation of Nature. This was actually established in 1948. Julian Huxley was its original founder. And this year we'll be voting on guidelines on the basis of future policy on how CRISPR applications via synthetic biology may impact conservation goals, either in a supportive way or in a detrimental way. But we come back to this nagging question of what is consensus? How can it be achieved? Is consensus unanimity of views? Or is it unity as defined, perhaps, in not every person involved needing to agree, but rather envisioning heading in the same direction? And I attribute the ways that Society of Friends or Quakers make their decisions. Could mean arriving at a decision wherein no one felt their position was misunderstood or was not given a fair hearing. The Women's Encampment for a Future of Peace and Justice use this kind of deliberation to come to what they define as consensus. We talked about provisionality a few moments ago. Provisionality in the face of new technologies, that is flexibility, moving from what's now a provisional set of guidelines to new ones, should include the choice to say no to particular visions of progress. And Sheila Jasanoff says very poignantly, foreclosing in advance the possibility of voting against a new technology leads to a policy of dissent and frustration rather than shared custodianship of the technological future. And she mentions a German council decision a number of years ago on PGT and PGD, where they were trying to decide whether it should be permitted. And the minority group said an enlightened and emancipated relationship to technology is the decision not to use it if it runs counter to established norms and rights. So what's actually being done to bring these people together, these numerous stakeholders, the scientists, but also these other people, the sociologists, the theologians, the bioethicists. There's an interesting group that is coordinated by the Danish Board of Technology called the Worldwide Views Alliance. This has been around since 2009. And I think it provides a pretty interesting format for how some may be able to conduct these discussions. It convenes for a single day diverse groups of approximately 100 citizens at numerous sites around the world to discuss topics such as global warming, biodiversity, climate and energy, and why not gene editing? The day is divided into 4 or 5 thematic sessions. The groups are moderated, and there are no more than 8 individuals per group, and they discuss a set of questions for each theme and then vote on relevant policy choices. It demonstrates the feasibility of large-scale representative deliberation on complex matters of global concern. There's another group that started in around the year 2000 or a little beyond. And this is, I've seen a fair bit of this in the agriculture literature. It involves diverse stakeholder perspectives across innovation stages. So whereas now we tend to deal retrospectively with, well, what do we do with this new technology now that it's out there? Here, governance would be approached and many stakeholders would be involved from the point of original design in CRISPR development. So it would be incorporated into a safe by design approach for early CRISPR development. This would explore in another tier how the participation is held and what kinds of issues should be seriously considered. The decisions made by these groups are then returned to the CRISPR developers to evaluate commercial viability. So at each of these stages, the developers of CRISPR get firsthand accounting of, are the red flags up high enough that we should abandon CRISPR development for this particular area up front? And this is brought in by numerous stakeholders. Now, I just wanted to mention this because it's just a whole nother dimension of gene editing and what some people consider it. This, in February of 2016, James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence in the US, added gene editing to the list of threats posed by weapons of mass destruction and proliferation. The reason this was done, it was said, because it's low cost using CRISPR, to develop gene editing. They gave a quote at that time of $60 US dollars. Online, the ingredients could be obtained. And differing regulatory standards internationally increased the risk of potentially harmful biologic agents and products. I have to say, I certainly agree with differing regulatory standards internationally, and that's an issue that needs to be discussed in many aspects of CRISPR development and application. So what are the key issues that we've briefly talked about we need to continue to reflect on? Should somatic genome editing continue in various fields? Medicine, we already know it's being applied. And I don't think I've seen very little, if any, objection to its development so far, except, as I mentioned, preclinical data tends to be very thin and should be improved in order to make sure that it's safe for human beings. Should there be restrictions on germline genome editing? Again, this is the research part of altering the germline of embryos for research purposes. Now, this is done in medicine. In agriculture, there are breedings of crops and livestock, particularly livestock. CRISPR is becoming very popular. And what often happens is that no new DNA is added during the CRISPR process, but as we said last week, individual bases for individual mutations can actually be changed very efficiently using CRISPR. Should heritable genome editing be permitted, and if so, what kind of deliberative and decision-making process should be used to decide acceptable uses? I just touched on a couple of them earlier. There's a whole literature that's developed on what kind of processes might be considered. Can the governance of gene editing be made international, or should and can governance only be a national responsibility? Here again, I've alluded to the Convention on Biologic Diversity, the International Union to the Conservation of Nature, which are all international bodies. However, they don't have any legal clout, and it's questionable how much one can impose international guidelines and global guidelines to countries that don't feel the same way. And this would raise another concern. Given the current problem with stem cell therapy, tourism, that is where people can't get stem cell therapy where it's not approved by regulatory bodies, they go to other countries where it is. Might we see the same thing with gene-edited cell therapy, which is now already in advanced clinical trial stages, and although not for CRISPR specifically, but for other gene editing, there are cell therapies available for cancer patients. Now, I just wanted to mention briefly questions that we can take home and reflect on as a people of faith, different faith commitments. We should learn about somatic gene editing cell therapies, discuss developing a faith-based community position if it doesn't exist. So, in other words, look at it, get educated, and try to figure out what these somatic gene therapies are in particular, because they're going to become therapies for ourselves and our loved ones down the road. Use those with gene editing knowledge and expertise, preferably from that community. Ask them to be available to consult with community members who are confronted with decisions regarding taking or being offered such therapies. We should discuss the current faith-based community's beliefs on alternatives to germline and heritable gene editing therapies. For different denominations, for example, there are issues with IVF, excess embryos, PGD, that is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and testing to select embryos out with IVF. I mean, all of these issues are still issues which vary in their ethical acceptability within different denominations. But then there should be crosstalk. What can distinct faith communities learn from each other regarding positions on somatic, inheritable, and germline gene editing? How are issues similar, or are they different in medicine versus agriculture, say? And what organizations with common concerns. I mentioned Hurlbut and the Global Observatory, for example. What kinds of policies and policy-making endeavors do they have that we could get onto and communicate and offer help with as individuals or as groups of faith, which would help to establish how we make these decisions as a society about what's acceptable and not acceptable uses of gene editing, particularly involving germline and heritable gene editing. I will leave it at that, and with the chair's permission, open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jim. That was fantastic. Thank you for leading us so eloquently through a complex technology that has so many implications, not just for humanity, but for the environment and cellular organisms of all kinds. I'm sure you've left us with many questions. I'm going to ask people again to write your questions in the chat box so that we can read them out and give Jim a chance to answer. We do have about 25 minutes for questions here. So I see a question from Karen to everyone. What is the place of the Canadian Council of Churches in helping these conversations happen? Will there be conversations later or only in teaching sessions?
Well, I think I'll defer that question to one of our co-chairs.
That's great. I mean, I think this webinar series has been a start by the Canadian Council of Churches to create a conversation about this technology and how it is right now affecting Canadian society and global society. You'll have noticed that many of Jim's slides talk about things that are happening in the last 12 to 24 months. So change is happening as we speak. And now would be a good time for faith communities to find their voice, I think. So one of the questions we have for attendees at the end of the webinar is, where should we take this conversation next? So please let us know your thoughts, how you see this conversation developing.
I can just add to that. I completely agree. We're at a pivotal point, as I tried to explain, in editing the gene, human or otherwise. It's just the numbers that I quoted in terms of the number of people involved, the institutions involved, the publications. It's just mind-boggling. But that should not be an excuse that we sit back and say, well, it's going to happen anyway, we'll just ride the road. I think we need to get involved. It takes time, it takes energy, and it takes collaboration with either those in various faith communities or those who are speaking from public forums. And we've made some contacts with individuals. Ben Hurlbut is one of them. And I think that's one thing that we need to seriously consider as a church council in order to both learn from the sources exactly what some of these concerns are, what the methods of deliberation and discussion are, and be invited to the table.
Thank you, Jim. Here's a question from Josie to the group. Josie points out that ownership of seeds changes when seeds are genetically modified and patents are filed for ownership of those genetically modified seeds. So she asks, what happens with humans who are considering genetic modification? Will humans be patented, and will ownership be applied other than the parents, I guess?
Well, that's a very futuristic question. And thank you for that. First of all, there are already gene therapies or therapies, cell therapies involving genetically modified human cells that are on the market. Having worked for Health Canada, I can speak to that directly from personal experience. These are often for cancer patients who have exhausted all other therapies, but those are somatic cell treatments. Those are taking that individual's own immune cells and genetically modifying them to make them more efficient, despite the presence of the tumor, so that the immune cells can be more effective. Heritable genome editing is not in anybody's radar, and it shouldn't be, and it probably won't be for the foreseeable future. But given the timeline that I've tried to demonstrate, foreseeable may be a year or two. So I think we have to watch this area carefully and find avenues where we can speak to those issues carefully, because again, it's a whole different area. There has been a Canadian group that has spoken up that Canadian policy should be adjusted according to this. And you have it right here. This was published in 2017, and it raises concerns about the failure of the government to properly update the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, which was first put into law in 2004. And this group, which was co-authored by Bartha Knoppers and Timothy Caulfield, Canadians in bioethics circles and law circles, and they essentially say, we consider the allowing gene editing in the context of research, including preclinical research on germ cells prior to implantation, that it conforms to the spirit of the act and that the guidance should be adjusted to reflect this. So here's a group, very influential, that are suggesting that this should be incorporated into the Assisted Human Reproduction Act in Canada, and that the research for germ cells should be approved and allowed. Now, that doesn't mean heritable genome editing should be done, that is, modified embryos be implanted into women, but it's a step that may lead to that. So I think there should be some discussion as to whether there are concerns about this, particularly in some faith-based communities.
Thank you, Jim. Question from Dan, which reflects to the pace of change. Of course, changes in the lab can rapidly advance a technology much more quickly than ethical and theological conversations about how these changes affect humanity can happen. So Dan asks, how do we overcome the problem where lab work far outpaces efforts at developing an ethical framework? How do we, you think you talked about slower science, Jim?
That's right. And I think one of the manifestations of slower science is to have slower ethics. And I don't mean do things ethically slower, but to study, take the time to reflect on these issues. And these issues should be reflected on by people who are getting the grants or applying for the grants in order to do CRISPR technology for different applications. And I know efforts have been made going back to at least 2008, 2009, where groups at Arizona State have actually gone into laboratories of basic scientists and had formal discussions with them about what have you thought about the longer term issues here with respect to the effects of this research, if it works and if it comes to fruition on society as a whole. So there are groups that have been trying to do that. I think what needs to be done is more formalization has to be done. And that three-tiered system that I mentioned during my talk, I think is one excellent starting point, where you actually have discussions at the point of the earliest development. Then if funding is granted, for example, are things panning out as we thought they might? And then ultimately, how is commercialization going to affect these questions and issues?
Thank you. James asks, what do you see as the so far best example of broad-based governance of healthcare policy? And he goes on to talk about some of the challenges we've seen on Ontario's COVID triage policy. If we're having trouble with this kind of a policy, what hope is there for CRISPR policy on a global basis?
Well, I think I gave you the impression I have a considerable concern, especially when the summits and commissions in the last year or two keep saying it's the nation, each nation has the right to do what it wants. Now, there are many poor nations in the world. There are many nations who sign on or even ratify some agreements, but they don't put anything in writing. There's actually an interesting paper, again, by Françoise Baylis, some of her colleagues, on global policy landscape, which I didn't have time to talk about, but that gives an excellent overview of what countries have said they would not allow heritable genome editing, for example, but what have they written down about it in their laws? And some of them, many of them have not. So this whole idea of governance is a real problem. And I'm not sure what the solution is. I'd probably have my own Nobel Prize if I ever got that far. I mean, I'm looking for that. But it's a real problem. You remember, when I started, I was talking about 1975, and many of the same themes are coming back to haunt us because we haven't dealt with them in the kind of way we probably should have back in 1975. The scientists, and I'm a scientist and science background myself, really could have done better, or should have done better in having the empowerment given to people outside of science as well as to themselves. So I'm sorry, I don't have the answer for this one, but I certainly encourage people who are interested in this field, particularly if you're a young person who's looking for a vocational pathway, to look at this sort of thing, because it's extremely important for humanity. And I think we need more people to invest their time and their efforts into this.
You made me think, Jim, about the challenge of humans being organized in nation states, right? Nation states ascribe to international treaties. They also have the right to refuse to ascribe to them, whether it's a ban on the use of landmines or around the use of genetically modified organisms, or whether you're going to support climate change reductions. CRISPR is another global issue to which nations can ascribe to do something or not. But that's how we're organized. Is there an alternative to that that works better, in your opinion? Or do you know anyone who's thinking about that?
It's a brief no and no. The United States has been the prime mover going back to 1975 and even earlier. It's had to gradually, painfully perhaps, step aside in order to allow some of these critiques and criticisms to be properly aired. And I'm really pleased that the Europeans and I can say now the British as well, given Brexit, have really been very vigilant globally about trying to set up frameworks by which these discussions can be taken. I mentioned the Danish Council. I hadn't been aware of this until I started to do some research for this presentation, for example. There's a huge literature out there now about just looking at how people can sit down who are from very diverse backgrounds and actually talk about the impact of new science technologies on all of us. Again, I don't have any answers, but there's certainly a lot to chew on out there as to possibilities. And I have to say, I'm really hopeful that people like Hurlbut and Jasanoff and others who are in key university positions, who publish in places like Nature and Science and express their concerns, that they can continue and bring others into the fold to increase the voices.
Thank you. Paul writes here, in your opinion, can we find the balance with supporting clearly beneficial and supported uses of this technology with the uses we need to discuss further? Or will some want to oppose the use of this technology completely? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, with up until now, any biotechnology, we've had many discussions. We had discussions about GMOs, the Cartier protocol looks at all genetically modified living organisms to try to ensure that they're safe. And that goes back to the year 2000, even the late 90s. But CRISPR is, again, the stakes are much higher and much different now because, if James Clapper can say this is a threat to the world, because for $60 US, you can go into your garage and get online supplies to allow you to do something with the CRISPR technology, then you got to realize that that's a real possibility. And for those who heard the first webinar, I hope that was driven home, that the precision of this new technology is what really makes it so both promising and threatening. And I think we've just got to realize that. I'm hoping that this group and other groups can get together and be very formative in their critique, but it requires more education for many people. It requires people who are articulate and can speak both the language and the terms of the science community, the sociology community, the theology community. It's a lot to ask for individuals, but I think that's probably the best way to go, that people are put in leadership positions who have that capability.
Thank you, Jim. I think we have time for one or two questions before we come to the end of our webinar and talk about the survey again. Amy asks here, in just a few sentences, can you summarize in simple or layman's terms how you would communicate this looming technology and its possible problems, say, to teenagers at home? I attended this webinar about CRISPR technology and some of the issues that are coming. How would one say that simply to young people, Jim?
Well, I would say the interest in CRISPR and the potential benefit of CRISPR to humankind has to do with its ability to clearly identify places on the chromosome that can be changed. In the past, we did this with other technologies, and I talked briefly about other nucleases in the first webinar. But there were many, many issues of imprecision that led to many more risks of tampering with other parts of the genome that could lead to even more problems than the one that you're trying to solve. This technology it's not perfect yet, but it's much more precise. And it can be applied to any living creature, from a bacterium that's 20,000 feet under the surface of the sea to, the biggest living creature and everything in between. I've talked primarily about its application to humans. There are others much more articulate than I can be about its application to agriculture, as the previous question said, about taking seeds. Seed tourism could be an issue where you've got genetically modified seeds that are approvable in some countries, but not in others. So I guess that's how I would try to explain it. It's I used the zipper analogy last time when I showed the diagrams of double strands of DNA and applying to the one zipper and making the cut and then repairing the cut. That's probably the best way to do it, but that can be done in now so many different ways. Just taking one little base pair or one little base of those 4 bases I mentioned, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, or you can have whole strips of a chromosome that can be changed. And now with prime or primer mechanisms, it's a very large part of the DNA that can be very accurately changed.
Thank you, Jim. I think that is going to bring us to the end of our question period. I see there are a number of questions here. Thank you, everyone who posited your questions for general discussion. We are grateful. I'm sorry that we have run out of time. I think Nicole is now going to be sending a link, perhaps she already has, to the survey, but we would be grateful for you to complete the survey about how you perceive this webinar, and also to tell us how you think this conversation might continue in ways that are meaningful and engaging to yourself and to your community. While people are beginning to complete the survey, I wanted to thank Jim. Jim, thank you for a thoughtful reflection on what is CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology and how it is transforming our world. And thank you for challenging us as the churches in Canada to take notice and to begin to formulate reasonable and faithful responses to this technology that is changing human life. We're grateful, Jim, that you have led us through these two webinars. We look forward to further faithful discussion in our meetings and perhaps in future public sessions. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
I also wanted to thank everyone who helped to create these webinars, to Nicole Rokas, to Rebecca Ivanov, Joan Masterson, Ann Mitchell, and Grace McCreary. Thank you for creating the platform of this Zoom webinar and helping us to have this large discussion across Canada. It would not happen for everyone's participation. We are grateful. Thank you. We have had requests for videos of both the first webinar and the second webinar. And I've been told that these videos will be available in late spring or early summer. So please stay tuned. This Canadian Council of Churches will be notifying attendees to these webinars that the videos are available for downloading at when they are finalized. And I wanted to give one last opportunity to our General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches, Peter Noteboom, to greet the attendees.
Thank you so much, Peter and Jim, Dr. Peter and Dr. Jim. It looks like we again scratched the surface of a dialogue that's really just beginning. And, you know, I really would like to encourage you to complete that survey form, because we need to know how to move beyond the sharing of this powerful information to dialogue and conversation about it, and deeper exploration in dialogue with each other. So your guidance, suggestions will really help us make some decisions about what comes next. So thank you. Of course, I'd also like to just give you the opportunity to and to mention the appeal for support for the Canadian Council of Churches. If you identify with the work of the Council and who we are and what we're about, then we would gratefully receive your charitable donations to the Council. Grace has also put a link in the chat box there to our Canada Helps account. Good, thank you. And back to Peter for a final word.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are so grateful that you took time out this afternoon to join us for this conversation. Many of you have also been part of the first webinar, and so thank you for continuing this conversation with us. We wish you all the best in the rest of your day, wherever you are in Canada, and we look forward to the opportunity for more conversations in the future. Have a good evening and blessings to all of you. Goodbye, everyone.